Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it's your online social psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in social influence. We will expand on social psychology studies that are covered in previous psychology courses, your general psychology, introductory psychology, whatever you call it, and developmental psychology, such as the Milgram studies, in the Bobo doll studies. However, because those have been covered in extensive details in previous classes, I will not really break down the studies in full, but rather kind of add additional information that may have not been covered in your previous courses. All right, with all that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with an introduction to social influence. The effects of other people on an individual's beliefs, attitudes, values, or behavior is the operational definition of social influence. Social learning is the capacity to learn from observing others, while self-efficacy is believing you can do something. So social learning is this greater umbrella construct that argues and demonstrates that we learn from observing other people. However, within that greater umbrella construct, there are specific theories, and one theory of social learning is the social learning theory. This theory argues that people are encouraged or discouraged to engage in both new and known behaviors, depending on their consequences of their actions, if the behavior fits motivational states of the observer, or if the observer identifies with the model. Kids who are frustrated are more likely to imitate violent models. So we have the capacity to learn from other people, and we are more likely to mimic or not mimic the behavior of other people, depending on, again, these kind of different criterias, how motivated you are to mimic that person or learn from that person. If you identify with that person strongly, so if you think, oh, this is a person I want to be like, you're more likely to copy that behavior. Obviously, if you think, oh, I don't want to be that person, you're less likely to engage in similar behaviors, and obviously consequences of their actions. If you watch someone perform an action and they got hit by a bus or whatever, they're going to jail, they did the crimes, then you're theoretically less likely to copy that behavior. And emotional states also play a role. So kids are more likely to imitate violent models they've seen, that they've observed when they are frustrated themselves. There's value of role models for members of underrepresented groups in various fields, such as women in STEM. Gupta in 2011 argued that stereotypes can be combated by exposing women to successful role models in STEM fields. This may be especially important during adolescence, when young women face pressures that turn them away from science-related interests. So kind of the idea here is that we have these greater, again, broad and broader terms, macro, chrono, cultural values, political systems, social values, social norms, economic systems, and from there we, things like gender expectations, gender roles. Not just from those systems, but kind of broadly speaking, again, keep this relatively short. And some of those things we learn are stereotypes. So, for example, 100 years ago, much more common, but, women cannot participate in STEM fields. They're more of a caregiving intrinsically. It's in their nature or something along those lines. They can't be engineers. And these stereotypes have been found to kind of pick up with age, so especially during adolescence when you're trying to pick a career path, for example. And the idea is to show role models kind of violating those stereotypes. Women in STEM or something along those lines can challenge those stereotypes and thus increase the probability that adolescent girls or younger girls in general will be scientific women or something along those lines. O'Brien in 2017 had middle school girls attend a science outreach program. Girls were randomly assigned to write about their favorite female role models in the program, later reported an increased sense of fit in science compared to those not writing about their role models. So this study, again, had middle school girls attend a science outreach program, and what basically the researchers were doing was kind of trying to get the girls to think about the role models that they were exposed to, women in STEM. And what they found, again, is that women who are the middle school girls who were asked to write about those role models reported, again, a higher sense of fit. So kind of the idea of fit is that you are comfortable in an environment. You feel like you belong in that environment. Your capabilities match up with the demands of a given environment. You fit well, like a puzzle piece is kind of the idea here. So basically, the results from this research suggesting that these role models can increase goodness of fit, again, kind of feelings of belonging, and capable of achieving whatever the requirements of a STEM program among middle school girls. Next, we have Bandura's Bobo doll studies. Again, we're not going to cover this too deeply because this has been covered in previous classes. However, YouTube link will be present in the PowerPoint slides. The main takeaway from these Bandura's study, RIP, semi-recently died. Kids watch a dude beat the shit out of his inflatable doll. If they watch a guy beat the shit out of an inflatable doll, the children are more likely to mimic that behavior, learn from that behavior theoretically, and themselves beat the shit out of that doll versus children who watch an adult play nicely with the doll, they're more likely to play nice with the doll. Next, we have the chameleon effect. This is operationally defined as a tendency to mimic unconsciously the nonverbal mannerisms of someone with whom you are interacting with. For example, a study found, or a set of researchers found, I should say, when explaining a photograph with a face-rubbing confederate, participants were more likely to rub their faces themselves. So kind of the idea here is that you're asking a participant to explain the photo, and in the same room as you is someone also explaining the photo or around you and they're rubbing your face, the participant is more likely to rub their face. When doing a different task with a foot-shaking confederate, that is someone who works, again, a confederate being someone who works for the research team, not a real participant, actual participants were more likely to shake their feet. None of the participants reported having any conscious awareness of the other person's mannerisms or that they mimicked them. Ching in 2003 argued, and found, I should say, an effect occurs mainly when the person is likable. However, it is also, research suggests that this is not limited to casual nonverbal behavior. So some of the research suggests that attitudes can shift in a person based on what another person thinks. And this is especially the case if they're trying to get along or they like that person as well. A fun little party trick is to take a drink of whatever your beverage and then see how many other people copy you, and then we'll start drinking as well. Take a sip or something along those lines. And this kind of an argument of this effect is that, in general, again, humans, a social species, a collective species, broadly stated, working in groups. Kind of the idea is that we have to kind of get along in general, kind of like each other. Therefore, this chameleon effect allows us to interact with each other and kind of achieve goals of the group. Media-inspired social learning. Social learning is generally positively adaptive. A show in Mexico featured a popular actor playing a character who advocated for literacy. The year before the show ended, about 90,000 people were enrolled in a literacy program, and Bandura found in a 2009 study that after the show aired, enrollment reached over 1 million people. And so the idea here is that this, this actor is super popular. Oh, that actor is learning, is becoming literate. Therefore, I'm going to emulate that person's behavior. However, there's some downsides to media-inspired social learnings. For example, the release of 13 Reasons Why, we all love it. Oh, you're my 13 Reasons Why. Woo, we like it. It's so funny. Was associated with a significant increase in monthly suicide rates among U.S. Youth aged 10 to 17. So a show, theoretically, at least according to the producers, designed to decrease suicide rates, actually increase suicide rates. So kind of a lesson in, if you think you're doing something, trying to do something positive to other people, consult some research first. Otherwise, maybe just say that it's not for educational purposes and or serves any social function, and is instead just pure entertainment. Next, we have social priming. Others influence us by priming ideas, norms, and values. When other people remind us of the norm to be fair or charitable, for example, often we are more likely to act in accord with those norms. While stopped at a traffic light, some participants approached, or not, by a passerby who asked for directions to a well-known store in a 2016 study. So you're at a stoplight, someone asks you, hey, how do you get to the store? And then theoretically you say, this is where the store goes. Next, what happened, though, the light turned green, but the researchers, again, in Confederates, positioned ahead of the drivers at the intersection, pretended to stall their car. So now it's green and we cannot go after giving directions to a Confederate. Those who had been primed by being helpful, that is, by giving directions to the passerby, were less likely to honk their horn at the stalled driver than were those who had not been asked directions. So here we have participants being primed to the idea of being helpful, being fair, being kind, or something along those lines. And priming basically is you expose someone to a stimulus or a certain situation, and then that stimulus increases the salience of a schema, or so increases kind of the accessibility of a schema. So kindness, helpfulness. And a schema is just kind of a mental structure of association. So you're activating thought process associations associated with kindness and helpfulness. Thus, people who had their helpfulness schema activated by literally helping someone, 30 seconds earlier, they are less likely to honk their horn, aka be very, very aggressive, and be like less patient than people who were not asked for directions. Next, we have the focus theory of normative conduct. And this theory broadly argues that the saliency influences norms. And we're going to look at two specific norms to make this a little more concrete. There are injunctive norms. These are beliefs about what behaviors are generally approved of or disapproved of in one's culture. And descriptive norms. This is a belief about what most people typically do. So injunctive kind of being our belief about what other people think of particular behaviors, and descriptive, again, what actually people do. So injunctive, you can imagine like 30 years ago, injunctive norm, we can believe that everybody disapproves of marijuana use. Like, it's a bad thing. But the descriptive norm is that at that same time that we believe that other people disapprove of smoking weed, at the same time, our descriptive norm, again, is that we also believe that everybody smokes weed. So you can have these things kind of in conflict between what the beliefs of society are and what people actually do, or what you think they actually do. It's not always accurate. So one example of this is a 2015 Supreme Court ruling on same-sex marriage in the United States. Oberfeld versus Hodges. Tankard in 2017 found people's perceptions of the injunctive and descriptive norms supporting gay marriage shifted following the ruling. The ruling changed the perception that gay marriage is acceptable, that is an adjunctive norm, and changed the perceptions about U.S. Americans supporting gay marriage, that is a descriptive norm. So again, this is an example of how, again, I will keep citing Bronfenbrenner, those macro level environmental factors, laws, in this case here, cultural norms, politics, influence norms, and they kind of trickle down to us and really interacting with each other in complex ways, but whatever. Point being, laws can impact norms. So in this case, now gay marriage is legal, and now we have a belief that our culture approves of gay marriage because literally, like, the highest courts of the land has said it is legal. And for descriptive norm, you can imagine, now more people are going to, gay people are going to get married now, or the people are going to be less homophobic or something along those lines. But ultimately, this big macro law changes, and this can impact norms. And as stated, these types of norms can conflate. So you can imagine like littering or something like that. So injunctive norm, shouldn't litter, and then descriptive norm, you're like, everyone litters anyway, whatever. Dynamic norms, which kind of gets at the question of how do we change the behavior in which so many engage? Well, dynamic norms, operationally defined as norms about how behavior is changing, may shed some light on this. Sparkman and Walton, very cool names, 2017 and 2019 hypothesized that highlighting dynamic norms would increase the probability of behavioral change. These researchers asked cafe patrons waiting in line to complete a brief survey. Some of the participants received information about the study's interest in food choices. Others about a static norm, that 30% of U.S. Americans eat less meat than they otherwise would. So static norm kind of just being like a base like statistic. Nothing's changing. It's just like, these are the facts. 30% of U.S. Americans eat less meat than they otherwise would if they weren't vegetarians or something along those lines. Other cafe participants received information about a dynamic norm. So here they were told that 30% of U.S. Americans are starting to change their eating habits to reduce meat consumption. What the researchers found was that participants who were given information about dynamic norms were actually the least likely to order meat when they got to the cafe cashier. By anticipating a shift in normative behavior, people were more likely to change themselves. So kind of the idea here is that dynamic norms demonstrate that people's behavior on the ground that are actually happening are beginning to change. In this case here, fairly large number, 30%. So these participants are seeing change, they're anticipating more change, and therefore they're going to change their behavior to kind of match up with kind of the group norms changing. Now, of course, you have to consider these participants. Maybe cafe patrons are more likely to eat less meat regardless, on kind of the fence about eating less meat. So now they get this little push. And so maybe the specific dynamic norm will probably impact kind of different groups depending on a whole host of background factors. But kind of the idea here is that you see norms are changing, you anticipate further change, and then a person will change their behavior, more likely to. Social contagion is defined as a phenomenon whereby ideas, feelings, and behaviors seem to spread across people like wildfire. Many behaviors are socially contagious, such as yawns, laughter, and applause. So even thinking about a yawn sometimes can increase the probability of a person yawning, but seeing a person yawn can increase the probability of someone yawning as well. Again, you also see this laughter and applause, but also something called mass psychogenic illness. And this used to be called mass hysteria. One example of this is a high school teacher in Tennessee reported a gasoline smell in her classroom and developed headaches, dizziness, and nausea. Once the idea of the gas leak spread and its supposed effects, more than 170 students, teachers, and staff members searched internally, and possibly thanks to confirmation bias, ultimately found such symptoms in themselves, and the entire school was evacuated. Further careful investigation by the Tennessee Department of Health determined that there was actually no physical cause of the symptoms. The authorities convinced everyone there was no gas leak and the symptoms suddenly disappeared, or through time. So here we have a teacher who reports smelling gasoline, and she has headaches, she has dizziness and nausea, and she obviously is going to tell the other faculty and officials at the school, the teachers, and theoretically whatever, the city or something along those lines. Word spreads, and now multiple people are saying, "Oh my gosh, I have headaches, I have nausea, I have dizziness. This gas is spreading everywhere." But what ended up happening was a Department of Health came, they investigated the school, and there was no gas leak. And once they were able to convince people there's no gas leak, the symptoms disappear. This is an example of mass psychogenic illness. So kind of like a collective anxiety that spreads amongst us socially. It's not that the symptoms aren't real. The symptoms are real. However, the source of the or the cause, suspected cause of this illness or whatever it is that's spreading does not exist. It's completely made up. So the symptoms are real. They're feeling it, but it doesn't exist, and it's spreading anyway, like a virus, bacteria, whatever. And there's research that documents mass psychogenic illnesses from at least the 14th century all the way to present, contemporary period. So some more recent recent examples in Afghanistan, some girls were reported feelings of or symptoms consistent with being poisoned, and multiple girls reported this, and the World Health Organization, United Nations, NATO, they investigated this and they found no evidence of poisoning. Again, but it spread anyway. So what some factors that predict mass psychogenic illness is kind of like you're already living in kind of like a highly anxious, highly stressful environment. And the sources of the mass, supposed poisoning or the gas leak or something along those lines are kind of related to things that actually exist in your present world often. So in this case, yes, Afghani girls were met with a lot of repression and were, had acid thrown on and all these other things. So those things do exist in the real world, thus making it more accessible possibly. So that stress though, and that real world conditions kind of then being behaviorally expressed or subjectively felt by kind of the collective of that already kind of oppressed or at-risk group, in this case Afghani girls, or in this case I don't know really much about Tennessee or how that applies in that scenario, but the point being these kind of greater conditions around us can impact these psychosocial phenomenon. And if you want a even more recent example, there's evidence from the United States House of Representatives intelligence report, and I believe a CIA report on this idea called Havana syndrome as well. If you're kind of interested in this other more recent possible examples. Next, we move on to the social construction of reality. The cultural worldview is internalized during childhood, reinforced with maturity, and becomes a profound form of social influence. Many of our beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors are taught to us in the first years of life, when we are virtually totally dependent on our parents or whatever the rearing structure is of a given culture or family or community for sustenance, security, and knowledge. As we mature, educational, religious, and social institutions further reinforce our own culture's way of viewing the world. Cultures contribute to the defining of social roles in social situations. So stopping there momentarily, we are born, hooray. Then our guardians teach us, values, attitudes, beliefs, and these are going to reflect also our kind of a greater culture or whatever their various subculture and beliefs are, but they're still going to be influenced in this modern era by the country you live in, the nation state. It didn't always exist, ladies and gentlemen. Nation state about 300-400 years old. But ultimately, we're learning these values and we are internalizing it. And then as we leave and we mature and we interact and we go to school and we are again kind of reinforced with these attitudes and values, you can go to church or you can go to other community groups or social institutions, your jobs, whatever. These institutions kind of reinforce the cultural beliefs and norms. Of course, people collectively, individually within small cultures have to interpret those greater beliefs and norms, where you get a lot of variation from, but regardless, they are influencing you because you're interacting with them. But ultimately, from this cultural worldview, we learn scripts for how to behave in different situations in different social roles. As a child, you learn which norms apply in which situations, but once you've internalized those rules, you don't need to decide consciously to be quiet or loud. The context itself automatically activates a norm, which then guides your behavior. So our cultural worldviews, this social construction of reality, of how we're supposed to exist, they help us define our social roles, so how different people are supposed to act, how whatever a 2-year-old is supposed to act, which varies by culture as well. How a teacher is supposed to act, how whatever a politician is supposed to act, a banker is supposed to act, whatever it is. And as a child, you have to kind of be told, okay, it's now quiet time, shut up. Like now, be quiet. You're in a classroom or whatever. You're in a library, be quiet. But as an adult, you enter into a certain social context, and that context will activate the norms, aka how you're supposed to act within that context. So these are can be referred to as scripts. So it's studied by Arts, and we're going to go for it. Heiss. I apologize to both of you if you're watching. I'm sure you're watching this, and I apologize. But this 2003, these researchers, I should say, in 2003, presented participants with a picture of a library or a train station and told them that they would be going to that location later in the session. Participants were then asked to make judgments in a lexical decision task. A lexical decision task is a task in which participants have to decide whether a presented string of letters is a word or a non-word. Only the group that expected to go to the library showed evidence of activating the concept of silence. Specifically, these participants were faster than either of the other groups to recognize silence-related words as being actual words. So kind of the idea here is that you have a string of letters together and they're all mixed up. So you can imagine the word quiet and it's whatever. It leads with the letter T. It is spelled backwards. It doesn't matter. And kind of what the researchers found is that participants who were told that they were going to the library were quicker to identify the words associated with the library. So for silence, quiet, studying, whatever, something along those lines. So basically the argument here is that the library is activating scripts and behaviors associated with being in a library. So thinking you're going to the library makes you kind of, unconsciously and consciously prepared to go to the library. Thus, that person is primed for concepts and behaviors associated with being in a library, in this case, silence. And they were able to, participants were told they're going to the library were quicker to identify words associated with going to the library. In a second study from the same authors, participants who expected to go to the library also pronounced words more softly in what they thought was an unrelated communication task. Now, one interpretation of this research is that the anticipation of entering a library automatically activated a norm of being quiet that then affected their speaking volume even before they left the lab. So in this case, participants who were told they're going to the library, when they were asked to complete a completion task, they spoke softer than participants who were told that they're about to go to a train station. Again, interpretation being that the library activating norms associated with cultural behaviors related to the library, that is being quiet. So as stated, our social construction of reality also extends to our social roles. So we learn about different social roles and generalized beliefs associated with particular social roles. So a firefighter, we learn that they put out fires and they're pro-social. They're good. We love the firemen. Which brings us to this Blessing study in 2012. Lovely last name. Blessing found that disabled people taking on occupational roles had improved senses of social connection, self-esteem, and overall quality of life. And there are multiple interpretations of this. One, a disabled person are often kind of alienated from society, excluded from the social world around them for a whole host of reasons. Lack of wheelchair access is kind of a common one, for example. So by having an occupational role, and theoretically one that is less alienated or some kind of a dignified social role, now this disabled person feels like they are now connected to the community. They're contributing to something greater than themselves. They are part of the collective, both physically, like actually being, if you work in a place, don't work from home, but also kind of psychologically and socially. You now belong to that abstract group that exists in your head. And that group can be the social role. So whatever these people are, librarians or something along that line. So now with that kind of greater sense of connection, that greater sense of belonging, you feel better about yourself. Your overall quality of life improves. So your social role, increasing the probability of these positive developmental outcomes, but you can also imagine being kind of a negative social role. So you're a torturer or something along those lines, which theoretically can decrease your overall quality of life. But ultimately, our social roles can give us kind of a sense of purpose and increase our overall positive developmental outcomes. Next, conformity, a phenomenon whereby an individual alters his or her beliefs, attitudes, or behavior to bring them in accordance with those of the majority. Autokinetic effect, if a small stationary point of light is shown in a pitch black room, it appears to move. This was leveraged in a 1961 study. Researchers had people individually judge how much the point of light moved within a dark room. Next, researchers put 2 or 3 participants together in a dark room and had them call out estimates of how much the light was moving. People started off with kind of different estimates, but after a few trials, the groups of 2 to 3 participants seemed to agree on how much the light moved. Furthermore, when a Confederate, again, someone who works for the research team, was inserted into the group, and the Confederate made very large assessments of how much the light was moving, the researchers found that the group, other participants, that is real participants, not the Confederates, would also report they would also estimate higher rates of movements of that light. If the Confederate was replaced by new naive participants, the remaining group members would sustain the group norms and bring the new participant on board with them. This continued over 5, quote, generations of participants. So to recap here, we have participants individually stating how much a light is appearing to move within a pitch black room, and there's some variation on this. However, when there was a Confederate in the room, through time, all the people started to agree on a particular estimate, and that particular estimate was the one influenced by the Confederate. And even when the Confederate left the room, new participants were kind of taught the previous group norm established by that Confederate for multiple, quote-unquote, generations. So kind of an example how a Confederate or a person in general can influence a group understanding theoretically through this idea of conformities. So people altering their beliefs about how much the light is moving to bring them in accordance, make them consistent with the majority opinion. So then the question is, did the participants actually believe that the light was moving more or anything, or are they just making up, they're just lying and just to fit in? So this brings us to a few different constructs. First, public compliance, conforming only outwardly to fit within a group, without changing your private beliefs. So you're changing what you say out loud, but you actually don't believe it. You haven't changed your beliefs. Then there's private acceptance, conforming by altering private beliefs as well as public behaviors. Rohrer in 1954 brought people back individually to judge the movement of the light. Those who had come to a group norm about the distance the light moved still viewed the light moving the amount of the group had agreed upon a year earlier. This demonstrates evidence of the social construction of reality. So those same participants who stated that the light was moving a lot, brought back to the lab a year later, and were individually asked about the light movement, they were more likely to report more movement of the light than people who had been previously in that Confederate original study wherein the Confederate gave large estimates. That suggests that they have privately accepted the movement of the light, demonstrating again the social construction of reality. So thus the idea is that participants conform to the norm based on informational influence. This is described as and occurs when others are used as a source of information about the world. They are not just trying to get along. So they generally believe that what they are saying is correct. And research suggests that this is more likely to occur in ambiguous situations where people don't really know what to believe or how to behave. There's not like a general cultural script for staring at a light in a dark room. That's not a common norm. So we're using other people to make sense of the world around us. So we're using them to get information about the world and specifically about this ambiguous task. And now we're more likely to believe that our actions reflect reality. Which brings us to our next classic seminal study here, the Asch conformity studies. Again, we're not really going to go into a lot of depth here, but I do provide a link to the experiment below. And in this experiment, basically what Asch did, he showed different length lines. So they drew lines on a chalkboard, for example, and they said, which of these lines are the largest? And what Asch did was have a Confederate pick the incorrect line. So they would say, line C is the longest line, even though it's actually the shortest line. And then what Asch found was that the majority of participants copied the obviously incorrect response. And then the question is, why? So in this case, unlike informational influence, we're in a ambiguous situation, we're relying on other people to get information, and then we're genuinely accepting our beliefs as correct. Here, you can look at the line and see it's incorrect. So why? So here, kind of one interpretation is normative influences. This occurs when we use others to know how to fit in. We want to be liked by the group, and we don't want to be rejected by the group. So for example, teenagers dyeing their hair, different piercing, new slang. So you're skibbity, you're sigma, whatever it is. You're doing it because everybody else is doing it. You want to fit in. Now, interestingly, 25% of Asch's participants never conformed to the group opinion in at least one experimental trial. Most participants acknowledged that they made choices they didn't believe were right simply to go along with the group. The participants reported feeling anxious, fearing the disapproval of others and wanting to avoid sticking out. When we stick out, we run the risk of looking foolish, and many people are reluctant to that possibility. So you can also imagine like in a classroom and everybody seems to be getting, everybody understands the material and you're thinking they're like, what the hell? I have no idea what's going on. I don't want to ask a question because I'm going to look stupid. Well, kind of similar here. In this case, you're disagreeing with the group. And well, you are now challenging the group and you may look like a complete fool. And people kind of don't like that kind of public social presentation of themselves, humiliation maybe. Because we are social creatures, that social rejection doesn't feel good. Or at least the imagined social rejection that we think we would feel or experience for disagreeing. Potential links of conformity. Some gender differences have been found, but overall they are quite small, like most gender differences. What seems to be more consistent is that people are more likely to conform to topics that they don't know about. So whatever, men more likely to conform about Vanderpump rules, like knowledge, something along those lines. They're not following the drums. And women more likely to conform to stereotypically men's behavior. I don't know, like a car, whatever cars or something along those lines. Of course, obviously, these are broad kind of stereotypes and generalizations. The size of the group matters. So kind of the larger the group within a limit increases the likelihood of conforming. So around 5, it really peaks, something along those lines. And kind of example, you can imagine like 1 or 2, 3 people clapping, but whatever. You could tell the difference between 1 or 2 people clapping and like 10 people clapping. But you can't really tell the difference between 49 and 50 clapping. 50 people clapping is kind of all the same at that point. And then group member unanimity, which, hey, I was only in speech class for 10 plus years of my life. So give me a break. But kind of the idea here is that even if you have like one dissenter, it dramatically decreases the probability of a person conforming. So Ash found that even just one dissenter decreased conformity to like under 10% in a 1956 study. Other evidence supporting the argument of normative influence. When people could write down their responses privately after hearing others' judgment, they almost never went along with the group opinion. This suggests that publicly going against the group played a pivotal role in participants' tendency to conform. So again, normative influence, kind of we are acting, we are dressing a certain way to fit in, to be liked by the group, to avoid kind of social rejection from the group. But if the group doesn't know what you actually think, then that pressure is relieved. So evidence, again, being that if you're able to privately write down your judgments, you are far less likely to conform to something that is just blatantly incorrect. Now, interestingly, in interviews, many participants expressed considerable concern for the solidarity and well-being of the group. This can be interpreted as valuing positive social relationships. This can be positively adaptive means of productively and harmoniously coexisting with others. There's evidence that people who come from more collectivist cultures, who strongly value cohesion, are generally more likely to conform than people who come from individualistic cultures. So this idea is kind of that, or this one interpretation of this could be that people did not actually change their beliefs and they weren't just blindly droning through it. Rather, they didn't want other people to feel bad. They cared about the overall well-being of this group, even though this group barely, just came together. So in an act of solidarity, doing something for other people, they said, whatever, I'll just agree with the group to make it. So it's not a big deal. Who cares? The stakes here, especially, are quite low. Therefore, that person's well-being is more important to me than just looking dumb for this experimenter, which is, it can be a very pro-social approach to interacting with people, which again demonstrates in kind of many of these most contracts in psychology, it's not like good or bad. It depends on the circumstances. And people perform a behavior for multiple ways. So people can perform the same behavior for many different ways, or I should say for many different reasons. And the same behavior can thus be negative in some circumstances or very positive in other circumstances. But ultimately, we all engage in some kind of conforming behavior, just the circumstances matter of that of when you conform, and also kind of your collective or quote unquote individual goals. What personality and situational variables influence conformity? The evidence for personality characteristics is very weak. There are some limited amount of evidence. Those who are less likely to conform tend to have a high need to achieve, a propensity to be leaders, but replication of these findings has not been great. Some evidence of greater self-awareness may be less likely to conform because they're more confident in their own judgments and less in need of other people's approval. People who have higher rates of intrinsic self-esteem, that is, feelings of self-worth based on who one thinks one really is, as opposed to self-esteem based on achievements that others may value, are more likely to help others resist conformity. So instead of extrinsic self-esteem, where you're getting self-esteem or your goals, you're motivated by something outside of yourself, money, another person's approval, some kind of position, instead kind of relying on intrinsic motivation, goals, and self-esteem. So you're doing an action because you want to master it, or you take satisfaction in it, or whatever your own personal #growth. Those people may be less likely to conform since they aren't really seeking the approval of theoretically other people at the same rate, which is typically the strongest evidence, but even then it's not cut and dry. Other situational variables, we've already talked about group size. So moving on to high status groups tend to inspire more conformity because they promise more social inclusion and self-esteem benefits. So in a 2017 study, 12 to 15-year-old adolescents responded to different opinion surveys, quizzes, and video rating tasks. They conform more to the judgments of high status peers than to low status peer groups. So the characteristics of the group and a person's social relationship to the group matter. So in this case, 12 to 15-year-olds, you can imagine like a bunch of whoever the loser group is, the poor little nerds, They're like, oh, you got to do this, to fit in. And you're like, and then a person who's not in the nerd group is like, actually, you guys have very little social capital. You're not that cool. You're a low status peer group. Therefore, I'm not going to listen to you. I have less of an incentive to conform to you versus a very popular group. In that case, being in that group, being included in that group, is associated with kind of more positive outcomes for the 12 to 15-year-old. You're one of the cool kids and you feel good about being included in that group. Val and colleagues in 2019 presented participants with hypothetical hiring scenarios. Participants were less likely to endorse hiring women when they were given information suggesting that their supervisor was sexist. This also occurred regardless of the participants' own beliefs and attitudes, and reflected their desire to conform to the organizational culture of the hypothetical company. So in this case, regardless if a person had sexist beliefs and attitudes or not, even when they didn't have those, they were more likely to demonstrate sexist behavior, that is, by being less likely to hire women when they believed that their supervisor was sexist. So this kind of demonstrates, again, kind of things outside your own individual beliefs, such as sexism here. Your behaviors can still be influenced by greater cultural beliefs or greater, and here, the company beliefs, the norms in that company or whatever, some kind of greater economic system, political system, whatever it is. But ultimately, if you think that the greater system, bigger than your own beliefs, are sexist or whatever, hold some kind of views, you're more likely to conform to those views, even if you do not have them yourself. A whole host of reasons for this. I mean, in a company setting, you get fired and then you don't have money and then you're screwed. So there's all kinds of different kind of situational variables that can be implicated in this finding. A person's reference group. This is a group with which a person strongly identifies with. They are a source of informational and normative influence. So again, informational, you're taking that information in an ambiguous situation and you're believing it. And normative, more likely to try and be just, you're performing a behavior to fit in with the group, and you want to be kind of included in the group. So a person's reference groups, we trust them more than other groups, and we want their approval more. So if a reference groups has a certain attitudes or certain behaviors, we are more likely to conform to them because, again, we trust them and we want their approval more. Escapism. When participants' beliefs in free will were undermined, these participants reported more meaninglessness, and that meaninglessness in turn was associated with higher tendencies to conform. A 2019 study from Moynihan suggested that conformity can serve as an escape from existential burdens and insecurity. So one interpretation of this from an existential perspective is these participants told free will was, they don't have free will or something along those lines. They're like, oh my God, nothing I do matters. Life is meaningless. What am I going to do? I'm having a meltdown. And those people who have higher feelings of meaningless are more likely to conform. So kind of the idea here is that now you're conforming to the group because now you have direction in your life. You have meaning. You're restoring meaning because the group is giving you norms and belief systems that can direct you and give you kind of meaning and understanding of life. You are escaping the burden of life being meaningless and you're here for nothing matters. Now you have found your purpose and you've reestablished a sense of connection in this group by conforming. In a survey study of former jurors from 367 jury trials, Waters and Hans in 2009 found that for 38% of the juries, at least one person reported that the juror would have chosen a different verdict if he or she had decided alone. So kind of a rough finding in this case here. The social pressure of a consensus, you can imagine yourself as the lone holdout, increasing the probability that a person will behave, in this case, whatever, convict or innocence, a person who's under trial, regardless of what they actually think. Moving on to minority influence. This is a process by which dissenters or numerical minorities produce attitude change within a group despite the extraordinary risk of social rejection and disturbance of the status quo. So as I've mentioned throughout this class, cultures, they come and go. Countries come and go. Countries or nation states didn't exist until whatever it was, 300 years ago. Things change. Thousands of civilizations fall and rise. So it is not just, everyone's like, oh, I don't want to be socially rejected. Sometimes people go for it. They dissent, try to create a new social order. So how do minorities exert their influence? Well, that's a heavy question, but we will just focus on a few possible explanations. We have Moscovici and colleagues in 1969. Their research indicated that a consistent minority can have an influence over the majority. Argued people tend to just to accept majority position, especially when they are not invested in the issue. This is known as superficial processing. So this kind of argument being that if you people in general just kind of accept the majority position, and especially when they don't really care, they're not invested in the issue. It doesn't really affect their lives, or at least they don't think it affects their lives. They're more likely to just go with the flow, accept the majority position. Next, we have conversion theory. Argues people are influenced by a minority because the minority's distinctive position better captures their attention. Tend to consider it more thoroughly. Deeper consideration contribute to a change in attitude. So kind of the argument here, as stated, a minority position is distinct by definition. The majority don't have it, therefore it can catch you have a higher probability of capturing someone's attention, and now you've taken somebody out of a kind of automatic process, that almost mindlessness that exists, when you're generally operating in the world, and now consciously or increase the probability that people use control process, consciously think about an issue and theoretically think it through more deeply, increasing the probability of a change in attitude or behavior. Martin et al. And colleagues, however you want to say it, in 2007 found that students who were initially not really invested in joining a student union were more likely to sign a petition supporting membership fees when they were persuaded of the union benefits by a minority rather than when they were persuaded by a majority. So some interpretations of this, as stated previously, minorities influenced via thoughtful processing. This tends to contribute to private attitude change that guides behavior. The majority influence is typically via automatic processing. Tends to be more superficial, shorter lasting, and less influential in guiding behavior. So kind of the argument here is that majority opinion, yes, you're more likely to just kind of go with the flow, but it's very superficial in nature. You're not thinking about it. It can also not really guide your behavior. You're just kind of neutral in general. So you're just walking by, whatever student union or where everybody has like those tables set up, and you're like, yeah, I don't really care. Like the current like environment is fine or whatever. It's whatever, neutral, and I'm just not going to think about it. I'm going to just breeze past it, or I really don't care. Versus a minority opinion, which you've never really heard of before, challenging kind of norms that you thought were universal, that can increase the probability that you now have to engage in thoughtful processing. You have to think it through, which can influence your private attitudes and consequently behavior. Now, obviously, there are a bunch of caveats to this, some of which we'll cover, and most of we won't. But for example, the minority opinion, it's more likely to convince someone when that material directly impacts their life, that there's some kind of maybe benefit or something in this new way of doing an action or performing this new action, in this case, paying membership fees to a union on some university. So maybe it gives you greater clarity or a different understanding of the problems in your life or whatever, the good things in your life, and how that minority opinion, in this case, the student union, can help improve your life or something along those lines. Which brings us to the minority slowness effect. Occurs when people who hold the minority position take longer to express their opinions. When people are asked about the attitudes on various topics such as sports, politics, celebrities, and social issues, those who adopt the minority position take longer to express their opinions, according to the 2003 study. Why might this be? Because it's risky expressing a minority opinion. You're flirting with social exclusion and negative reactions from the people around you, which doesn't feel good, and especially if you think you're the only one who holds that opinion, or there's not people around you who holds that opinion. So you're kind of a one-person army situation, in your mind at least, which may or may not be accurate. So thus, it kind of takes longer, this slowness effect. So people who hold this minority position taking longer to express, potentially due to kind of the risk associated with it. Or I should say risk of expressing their opinions, especially when those opinions are, matter to like a macro kind of level, political opinion, like cultural opinion, social issue opinion, stuff like that. There are real world consequences to these things. Muchifana in 1991 showed that study participants' ideas about how to market two historical landmarks in Perugia, in Italy, to increase tourism were more creative when participants thought that using these sites was advocated by the minority rather than the majority. As people think extensively about the minority's argument, they often think about different perspectives from themselves, which allows for the consideration of novel and creative possibilities. So when participants were told that using these sites as tourism or whatever, maybe it's disapproved, but ultimately it's a minority position, those participants who were told it's a minority position were more likely to give creative ideas how to increase tourism for these two Italian landmarks versus participants who were told this is a majority position. And kind of the idea here is that the minority position can increase the probability that you think from someone else's perspective. So this is a person who doesn't really think like everyone else, they have a different opinion. Okay, let me take their perspective and think it through, what they would argue. So it's increasing the probability that you think in uncommon, creative, non-automatic ways. So you're leaving your kind of bubble, your box, because you kind of have to, by definition, think differently, think in an uncommon way to convince other people. So thus, kind of engaging with a minority opinion can increase a person's like imagination, their perspectives on what is possible, increase creativity, new novel possibilities for, in this case, these tourist sites, but you can imagine greater or other real-world examples of social possibility. So when is minority influence strong? On matters of opinion rather than, quote, fact. Wiki, sorry again, I know you're watching, in 2004, research on quiz shows that allow contestants to consult an audience suggests that when it comes to facts, majority opinions usually are accurate sources of information. Minorities tend to have their greatest influence on matters of opinion. Minorities had less influence when Italian students were asked, quote, from which country does Italy import most of its raw oil, than when students were asked, from which country should Italy import most of its raw oil, according to a 1996 study. Now, granted, what is facts can be debated. These are really kind of just like trivia little things, like what year was the United States Constitution written or something or signed? But that's really not often how people, especially in contentious social, political, economic, normative big issues, that's really not kind of how these kind of debates and arguments go down. And often people don't share this opinion on what is a quote-unquote fact and what is an opinion. But regardless, kind of the idea here is that in these kind of like distinct, almost like trivia kind of questions, in general, the majority opinion is typically accurate, but of course there are many exceptions to this. But like, what's the capital of the United States? Blah, blah, blah. We got it. Like it is what it is. Versus where should the capital be? In those cases, those more opinion-oriented questions, minorities can have a greater influence on non-minority people's attitudes and behaviors. Also, when the minority is self-confident and consistent, and when the minority presented style is flexible and open-minded. So if you're like, oh, I don't know, like doing that little emoji thing, and you're consistent, or not consistent, I should say, the minority position has kind of less influence, because if you don't know, why the hell should we believe you is maybe one explanation here. And another one, if a person identifies with the person attempting to persuade them toward the minority opinion, so literally you are them. You see something in them that represents you as well. Now you're like, oh, wait a second, that person is like me, or they're working on behalf of me on this collective, maybe solidarity, whatever it is, project thing. Now I'm more likely to be persuaded by them, because we are one. We are the world, people. Also, when it achieves the affection from a majority, so a 1974 study found that a jury decision-making when a minority is more influential when the minority can achieve a defection from the majority than when it starts with someone already on its side, undermines an us versus them mentality. So basically, someone switching sides kind of gives you evidence, oh, wait, maybe this minority has credence their kind of arguments. Also, it decreases that us versus them. So the minority versus the majority, rather, so it kind of reformats kind of the categorical organization and allows for an opportunity to maybe resort in a new category and thus bring new people to your sides and kind of change whatever norms or whatever the hell it is that you're trying to do. So some of the fun things that social psychologists do is kind of embed themselves in real-world environments. So in this case here, Cialdini spent a few years undercover, going into car dealerships and taking sales positions to find out which sales techniques are the most effective for getting people to pull out their credit cards. And what Bob found was consistent with Bem's self-perception theory. This theory argues that once we freely engage in a behavior, we often infer, that is, adopt, attitudes that are consistent with that behavior. So we do something, and then we're like, oh, wait, I now have to interpret why I'm doing this. I'm going to accept attitudes that are consistent with that behavior, which we've talked about in previous chapters. So what Mr. Bob found in others, some techniques of getting what they want, sales people. One is the foot in the door effect. People are more likely to comply with a moderate request after having initially complied with a smaller request. When you comply with a smaller request, you are likely to infer that you are the type of person who helps others or is interested in a particular cause. This can result in a shift of self-perception. You become more receptive to the related but larger second request. Once you have this new view of yourself, refusing the second request would likely arouse dissonance. If you agree to let a door-to-door salesman into your home, you may infer that you have some interest in hearing about the products being sold, which makes you more likely to give that product a try. So literally foot in the door. You can imagine a salesperson comes to your home, you try to slam the door in their face, and they put the foot in the door. So you cannot slam the door in their face. With the goal being that you initially agree to a small request. So maybe you talk to them, maybe you take a little brochure, maybe you allow them to come inside and talk to you a little bit. And this effect suggests that once you comply with that small request, you are more likely to comply with a more moderate or the next request. And one interpretation is that you are interpreting your behavior. So like, oh, I just let this person in. Oh, I just let this salesperson into my home. Oh, okay, well, I guess that means I'm interested in this thing. Maybe I'll be more likely. Now I'm going to listen to them more, because otherwise, if I'm not interested in this thing, what the hell is this person in my home? This is creating dissonance, friction between two thoughts. I have to be consistent is kind of the argument here. Therefore, I'm more likely to keep going down that path. Eventually, I'm going to leave with a new vacuum, just because I initially did not slam that door in that person's face. Talked to them, came into my house, they demonstrated it. Next thing I know, I got the damn vacuum. Some evidence of this: Berger and Caldwell in 2003 asked one group of participants to complete several questionnaires. At the end of the study, participants were asked if they would be willing to volunteer a couple of hours the following weekend, helping to sort food donations for a local homeless shelter. Approximately 32% of the participants volunteered. A different group of participants were first asked if they would sign a petition to increase awareness about the plight of homeless people. 51% of the participants complied with a fairly substantial larger request if they had first complied with a smaller request. So we have kind of two conditions in this study. In the first condition, participants are just completing some random questionnaires, and then they're asked if you're going to volunteer. And this Berger found 32% of participants wrote that they would volunteer. Now, in the second condition, we have the participants were immediately asked to sign a petition to raise awareness about homeless people. And then at the end of the study, again, this group of participants were asked if they're willing to volunteer on their Saturday. And what they found was that 50% of participants agreed to do so, a substantial increase compared to the original 32% number. So you sign that petition, you're like, woo, I'm the change of the world. I'm the champion of the underprivileged. I'm a revolutionary or something. I don't know. And then, so you have that on your mind, and now you get to the end of the study and they ask you to volunteer, and you're like, oh shit, I just said I'm champion of the people. Now I'm far more likely to be consistent with that shift in self-perception that I'm a champion of the people. Now I'm more likely to volunteer my time on Saturday. Next, we have the norms for social commitment. This argues once people make a public agreement, they tend to stick to it even if circumstances changes. Most of the time, behaving in line with such a norm fosters healthy social bonds, while reneging on an agreement earns a reputation for being untrustworthy. So to be consistent, once we say we're going to do something, we're far more likely to do it. Because if we don't, then you're a snake, you're a worm, you're deceiving, you're tricking people. You have increased the probability that people aren't going to trust you, which decreases your social bonds with people around you, which matter. We're social beings. We exist in a web of social bonds. Next, we have lowballing. Occurs when, after agreeing to an offer, some find it hard to break that commitment, even if they later learn of some extra cost to the deal. Cialdini in 1978 immediately told participants that a study would be taking place at 7 in the morning. Well, only 24% of participants agreed to sign up. 56%, or I should say that number is 56%, when people were first asked if they wanted to participate in a study, and only after they said yes were informed that it took place at 7 in the morning. And not only that, 95% of that 56% number showed up. So in this case here, participants agreed to an offer, that is to participate in a study, but then they learned of an additional cost. That is, they had to wake up at 7 in the morning, but they're already pot committed. They made that social commitment, and now they are trapped, and people feel they have to kind of carry out the action. So thus, if you told a participant right off the bat that they have to show up at 7 a.m., they're like, screw that, 75% or 76% of participants, they didn't previously make any commitment. They weren't pot committed. So they immediately could just walk away. Versus you say yes, you're in the game, you're pot committed, you have a social commitment, now you're in it, and now you're like, oh shit, not only do I have to do the study, it's at 7 a.m., crap, that's an extra cost, I'm stuck. And you're more likely to do it. Still though, 45% or 44% did not do it, but still you see that big kind of increase in this 1978 study, more than double. Berger added that the effect of agreeing to an initial lowball request is specific to the requester. If someone else brings the added cost on us and asks if we'll still follow through, we tend to walk away from the table. Unlike the foot in the door, lowballing requires only initial commitment that binds one to the agreement with another person, not the enactment of any behavior that changes one's view of the self. So in this case here, if someone else, so imagine buying a car, you're like, all right, woo, I got this car deal, and then you agree to it, and then but then that same employee is like, oh, what about this warranty? What about this other thing? Blah, 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 these other add-ons. Well, you're more likely, you're already pot committed, and you're more likely to agree to that person's action. Now, even though you haven't paid for anything yet, that's kind of the key point here. No behavior has actually been performed. You've only agreed to do something, but you have not participated in this study yet, the 7 a.m. study. You haven't bought the car yet. All that's happened is that there's a social agreement that exists. Versus, again, you're buying a car, and then some other manager walks in and he's like, hey, what about this warranty? And you're just like, oh yeah, what about it? And then at that point, you are not socially committed to that person. You've never seen that person before. You're less likely to get a low balled. So as stated, unlike the foot in the door effect, lowballing only requires a social commitment. Not the enactment of any specific behavior, not letting the salesman in your house, not signing a petition about how you are the champion of the homelessness, even that is a behavior. Here, you're doing nothing has actually been happened, but you have some kind of social commitment based on purely a verbal kind of like agreement. Moving on to reciprocity. This is seen in animals and non-human animals. Vampire bats regurgitate some of that blood to share with other bats, for example. Sharing is more likely to happen when bats that have shared their own blood in the past. This is often used to induce compliance and often plays a role in negotiations. So as a side note, bats, very cool animal, possibly my favorite animal. It's a flying rat, pretty cool. You see reciprocity across multiple species, especially other mammals. And this can be, again, used to induce compliance. So kind of the idea here is if someone does something for you, you're more likely to do something in return. So some research suggests somebody gives you a Coke, you're more likely to buy tickets for their raffle or whatever, their charity or something along those lines. And interestingly, reciprocity can occur even if the person who's doing something for you is not particularly kind, depending on the context. Kind of the rule of reciprocity will exist even if somebody is kind of being a bit rude to you. If they did something for you, you're more likely to do something kind of for them, broadly speaking. Door in the face effect kind of demonstrates negotiations. This is a phenomenon whereby people are more likely to comply with a moderate request after they have first been presented with and refused to agree to a much larger request. For example, your child says they want a pony for Christmas, and you're like, hey, here's what's going to happen instead. You're getting a My Little Pony video game instead. So you start very, very large, and then that kind of gives you room to compromise. So you want a new pony, you said get a video game. You want a $10,000 raise, and then your manager's like, okay, I'll give you a $3,000 raise or something along those lines. So start high and then go low. That's kind of like a compromise position. Not to be confused with the foot and door effect where you start low and then you go high. Okay, so make sure you know the difference between these two. Hint, 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 slash, it's probably all these reciprocity things, some of them will be on a quiz. Next, we have social proofs. This is a tendency to conform to what we believe respected others think or do. This makes salient a descriptive norm, again, a norm of what we actually think people do. But in this case, it emphasizes the special value of information about what similar or respected others have done. So it's not like to generalize other people do. Instead, now we're kind of narrowing it to people that we respect, what it is that they think and do. As social comparison theory posits, we often look to similar others to provide us with information about what is good, valuable, and desirable. For example, we value our friends' recommendations more than just a random person walking down the street in general. Next, we have scarcity. People have a preference for anything in short supply, this kind of model argues. Circuit City, for example, a store that went bankrupt. Good times. A store that kind of like Best Buy for our newbies out there, our the youth of the world watching this video. Anyway, Circuit City store that was going out of business and having a, quote, liquidation sale for a, quote, limited time. Instead of lowering the prices on products, the company charged with orchestrating the liquidation of the store's inventory actually raised the prices, according to a 2009 study. So kind of the idea here is that if you think, oh man, this is going on sale, or this is on sale, it's going to be limited time, it doesn't even really matter if the prices are actually, in this case, even higher. You believe that there's limited and you have to act now or you're going to lose out. And obviously, there's going to be a range of this. If something's like $10,000 more, you're, whatever. It's less likely in this Circuit City example, but kind of within a range of reasonable, whatever that means to you. Obviously, it can depend on the class, but the price of an item, kind of the marketing of this limited few of product available, a short supply, increasing the probability that you will buy the product. Moving on to mindlessness. Many daily routines and tasks are scripted. They run on autopilot. Once these scripts are set in motion, we sometimes fail to stop and think about whether or not our actions are actually reasonable. Specific requests can break automatic tendencies. So in general, as stated, our brain is lazy, trying to get the most out of doing the least. And we operate in a world that is pretty much common every single day. You expect to see the same things, and typically, especially the higher class you are, and depending on what country you live in, the higher class of on a world ranking, you are more likely kind of to see the same shit every single day. So you can just kind of run on autopilot. So an example of this is a Langer study from 1978, wherein a Confederate asked if she could cut in line at a photocopy machine. When the Confederate explained her request by saying she was in a rush, 94% of people agreed to let her go ahead, compared with only 60% when the person gave no reason whatsoever and simply asked to use the copy machine. In another condition, a Confederate asked to use the copy machine because I have to make some copies. In this scenario, 93% capitulated to this request. Very similar to the original 94% of people who agreed to let the person cut in line because they were in a hurry. This suggests that kind of scripted, autopilot mindlessness can stunt our creativity and contribute to us behaving and thinking in a rigid way. So kind of the idea here is you're just thinking you're in line waiting for the copy, you're next in, or waiting for your turn on the copy machine, and someone wants to get in front of you, and they just give a reason. You're not even really even listening to what they have to say. You're just like, okay, yeah, they give me a reason. Who cares? And so you're running basically on autopilot. You're not consciously processing that information. You are mindless in that area. Thus, you're acting more rigid. You're like, okay, you heard something. You're just going to assume it's a great excuse, and then they go ahead of you, and you do not mind. You capitulate to that request because it's running on autopilot. It's kind of the interpretation here. And by it, I mean like your cognition. A study by Santos in 1994 tested if a person would be more likely to give change to a panhandler who A, asked for a quarter, or B, asked for 37 cents. Now, the economic rational hypothesis would argue a rational person would answer A, because 25 cents is less than 37. You want to save your money, or it's an economic hypothesis wherein you're trying to maximize profit, save money whenever the chance you get. So thus, you're only going to give a quarter if you're going to give anything at all, not 37 cents. What the researchers found that when passerbys were asked if they could spare any change, about 44% complied. When they were asked for a quarter, about 66% complied. When they were asked for 37 cents, about 75% complied. This specific request breaks some people out of automatic tendency to say no, while also leading them to think that there's a good reason that the panhandler needs this exact amount. So the amount requested, 37 cents, is an odd number. It's got pennies in it. It's strange. And you're thinking now that breaks you out of this automatic tendency, this mindlessness, that autopilot way of interacting with homeless people. Like, I'm just going to keep walking, going straight, like whatever, just ignoring it, autopilot. Now it's like, wait, what the hell? 37 cents like snaps you out of it for a second. It's like, wait, what's going on here? Now you're more likely to process this information, and you're like, oh, maybe. And one possible interpretation is you're like, oh, I guess 37 cents is very specific. This person must have a very good reason to request a specific number. Therefore, I'm more likely to give that panhandler, this homeless person, 37 cents within a quarter. Another interesting example of mindlessness is recycling. Trudell in Argo in 2013 found that people were more likely to recycle a can if it was whole than if it was crushed. They also found that a whole piece of paper was likely to be recycled, but if the same piece of paper was cut into small pieces, it was more likely to be dropped in the garbage. Kind of the idea here is that an automatic process, you look at a piece of paper that's ripped into pieces, you're automatically processing that as trash. We are relying on familiar categories, just something that's damaged and a little like busted up, a piece of paper ripped into pieces, a can cut in half or something like that, or crushed. Now in our mind, we're sorting that into the category of garbage. Therefore, we're less likely to recycle that object versus a whole piece of paper, wherein now we see the whole paper, the whole unit, and we're like, oh, it's easier to imagine that as not trash and capable of being recycled. So mindless in this case, contributing to inaction, the inaction being decreased likelihood of recycling based on, again, this automatic process of categories, specifically what is trash and what is not trash. Some ways to combat this is to design environments that make recycling less cognitively taxing. You can design recycle bins that have specialty lids where the shape and size of the holes resemble the type of item they're for, like a hole for cans or a slot for newspapers. Specialized lids are like cues for how to use the containers. Duffy and Vergas in 2009 arranged it so that 30 recycled containers placed throughout an academic building were topped with either specialized lids or had no lids on top. The researchers found that the containers with specialized lids increased the rate of recycling by approximately 30%. So in this case, this demonstrates that your environment influences your behavior. So rather than just focusing on, all right, we're going to educate everybody on why you have to recycle, instead, create an environment wherein people are more likely to engage in recycling behaviors. And specifically in this case here, you have these recycling containers that have different slots that are the shape of the item to be recycled, which in this case can kind of direct a mindlessness towards kind of an automatic process that increases recycling. You're just looking at you don't really have to think it through. You're just playing, shape game at this point, like a 3-year-old, putting the Coke can into the little Coke receptor. So basically the environment creating new kind of automatic processes and decreasing how long you have to think it through, because again, we're kind of shape based here, contributing to a greater increase in rates of recycling. Now, granted, I would recommend you look into the recent research on the degree to which you can actually recycle plastic. But with that said, you can recycle other things. But plastic, all right, I would recommend Googling that as a side note. But point being, instead of solely focusing on, I'm going to change this person's behavior, I'm going to convince them, do blah, 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 you can create environments to increase the probability of a behavior. And the current environments that you currently live in, that we all live in, increase the probability of certain behaviors already. So using a kind of mindful or cognitive or thoughtful processes to create environments that allow people to engage in automatic processes that are less harmful to each other or the environment or something along those lines. Next, we have obedience to authority. Any action engaged in to fulfill the direct order or command of another person. Pressure to obey is direct and explicit, involves commands, and is a common form of social influences, sometimes essential to preserve societal health and functioning, such as during COVID. So here, unlike conformity, you're being directly told what to do. You have a command. Someone above you is telling you what to do, rather than horizontally looking to your peers and figuring out what to do. Here we have an authority. They tell you explicitly how you should act. Again, for all these things, there are pluses and minuses. Sometimes obedience is essential. Don't drive 200 miles per hour in a residential area, for example, or during COVID. Use basic precautions to theoretically reduce the rates of death. during the height of the pandemic. And next we have the Milgram studies. Again, we're not going to cover this in too much detail, but this is the classic research on how much punishment a participant is willing to dish out on a different fake Confederate participant. In this case, how much and how many voltage of electrical shocks will a participant administer to a Confederate if they're told to do so by an authority figure. Now, what are some of the factors that affect obedience? Again, you can watch the YouTube video embedded in the previous slide. Distance and legitimacy are two important factors that influence obedience. If the experimenter phoned in the instructions from a distant locations, full obedience was reduced to 22.5%. In a variation in which the victim was in the same room, full obedience dropped to 40%. Another version of the study where participants had to physically place the learner's hands on a shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%. So in this case here, the physical distance of the person giving the order and the victim can influence the rates of obedience. So if the person who is giving the order is far away, you're less likely, and you're giving the order through a phone call, you're less likely to obey. And if the victim is in the same room as you, you are less likely to obey. So in this case, you're less likely to administer shocks. And moreover, if you have to physically take the participant's hand and put them on the electrical plate or something along those lines, the participants are far less likely to engage in obedience. And again, the obedience being that the participant has to shock another participant who actually works for the research team, and it's not a real shock being administered. Some empirical research supporting this idea of distance contributing to obedience. Recent studies provide evidence that remoteness facilitates killing behavior. In a 2017 study, participants were told that they were testing an apparatus used to kill insects, in this case, ladybugs. Participants completed the procedure either while in the same room as the machine or via video conference with the machine not in the same room. Even though ladybugs are generally positive regarded, participants kill more bugs in the remote condition. So in this case here, again, the victim, in this case ladybugs, are further away from you. They're far more abstract. They're just kind of a video screen. They're not in front of you. You're not getting blood all over yourself and guts of the bug. You're just watching a video screen and you're pressing a button. It's almost like a video game. In those conditions, wherein the bug killer is a video conference that you're kind of zoomed in versus in the same room as you, the people in the video conference condition are more likely to kill more bugs. Demonstrated that remoteness can facilitate killing behavior in these ladybugs. In aerial bombing, soldiers launching the bombs neither see nor hear their victims. The highest civilian casualties in wars have come from this form of violence, in which victims are physically and psychologically remote. So, do you hear with aerial bombings, you are literally, very far away from the person being bombed. So you're physically far away, but also psychologically very distant. So they kind of look like bugs to you on a screen, and thus are kind of less human to you. So physically and psychologically remote, this can kind of theoretically contribute to increased civilian deaths or being comfortable with civilian deaths. There's good research on this as drones as well. So drones kind of operating out of one country and then bombing a country very far away. So interestingly, in an alternative experiment, the real participant didn't physically flip the switch on the shock generator. So usually in the first original experiment of Milgram, you press a button and the shock is delivered / there is no shock. But rather in this alternative experiment, the real participant delivered the memory test and another supposed Confederate participant delivered shocks. In this case, approximately 93% of the participants obeyed fully. So when people contribute to but are not physically causing the harm, most resistance to participating in atrocities sanctioned by authorities seem to vanish. So in this case, you are not directly giving the shock, rather you are performing the test, and if the participants basically messed up on the test and they get shocked. So if you're the one administering the test and a different participant is delivering the shock, people are far more likely to conform. Now, they are not directly causing physical harm. However, they're kind of in that chain of harm, that chain of violence, but kind of that psychological distance between what you're doing and that extra step of the harm done to somebody else radically increases the rates of obedience. So you can imagine someone being like, okay, well, I didn't directly do it. I'm just in this chain of things that happen. I'm something bigger than myself. In that case, everybody's conforming, and ultimately the same behavior or the outcome is going to largely be the same. So if you can create psychological distance between people and put them in a chain of behaviors all linked to each other, far more likely to be obedient. When the authority is seen as being more legitimate, the rate of obedience is higher. So if a study was run in an unimpressive-looking building rather than a prestigious university, full obedience was reduced to about 48%. If the person directing the real participant to deliver the shock seemed to be another participant in the study instead of the experimenter, the full obedience dropped to 20%. So kind of the idea here, if you believe the authority is legitimate, you're more likely to obey. So one example of this is kind of the building. So if you're like, you roll up and you're like in a shack, you're like, oh, this place is sketch as hell. I don't trust any of these people. I'm not listening to that shit, what they're saying. Or you're far less likely to. Versus like, you're going to Yale, you're going to a famous political institution, an economic institution, where these are the social role models of society. You think they have those positions for a reason. They are a legitimate source of authority for you. In those conditions, you're far more likely to obey. And same thing with the person giving you the order. If that person is dressed in a lab coat and famous or a doctor, versus like some grungy looking person, unshaved or whatever, just kind of a complete mess. You're like, I don't know who the hell you are. You are not fulfilling a social role of a legitimate authority figure. I'm far less likely to obey you. So other questions related to this. Women have been found to exhibit approximately the same amount of obedience as men. People from different cultures show similar levels of obedience. However, obviously not all countries have been tested. For example, Poland has showed similar levels of obedience. And then you'd have to investigate kind of the cultural and historical background of these different countries to see if there's any consistency in these kind of cultures that would have similar levels of obedience. But for a different discussion. There are few, if any, personality differences in who obeys, according to a Blast 2000 study. And Berger, 2009, found that people who are high in empathy for others tended to need a prod sooner than less empathetic people, but they ultimately just as likely to be fully obedient. So if you're empathetic, you feel, I feel your pain or whatever, those people are more likely to be a little more hesitant. But Berger found that basically all you have to do is just prod them a little sooner, just telling them, hey, keep going a little bit more. A little more often and a little more frequently and a little more earlier. And interesting about this, you got to keep in mind that for this Milgram study and all these other versions of them, there's no direct gun to your head or anything like this. It's just a volunteer study with a person that you've never even heard of. So theoretically, in more legitimate conditions or something somebody believes in, or there's more direct threat to you, maybe you're more likely to be obedient. There's some evidence that defiant participants are lower in authoritarianism. This is a broad personality trait that is characterized by a submissive, uncritical attitude toward the ideal moral authorities of the in-group. So this is the kind of idea here. If you're very high in authoritarianism, the idea is that people in your in-group, and especially leaders in your in-group, you're more likely to accept anything they say regardless. You're more submissive towards them. So kind of fitting that that there's evidence that there's a correlation between being high in authoritarianism, moralizing, having uncritical attitude to people in your in-group, you're more likely to follow the leaderships and orders of those people in that in-group. And there's conflicting research about Milgram's, the results today. Some people have argued that obedience has increased. Others have argued it has decreased. There are probably going to be contextual differences in kind of historical circumstances that kind of contribute to obedience. And I should say the most negative forms of obedience, because as stated, there are many instances of obedience that are positive for kind of the greater group.